So for the record, pursuant to the order of reference of Tuesday, May 9th, we're dealing with the order of reference now rather than a pre-study, of Tuesday, May the 9th, 2017, Bill C-44, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 22nd, 2017, and other measures. And this afternoon, we're fortunate to have from the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, Kevin Page, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer, and Mr. Can, who is the Executive Vice President, will be a little late getting here. He's before, I believe, the Senate Committee at the moment. And I might mention as well, there may be a vote. I think it's scheduled for some time around 4:15, so that will disrupt the hearing for a little while, and we may have to suspend. So, Mr. Page, the floor is yours. Just one sec, Mr. Reid.
On a point of order, I was just thinking that suspending, perhaps what we could do is agree in advance that we'll take some of the time. If we do this by unanimous consent, we could do some of the time before that vote. It's typically a 30-minute bell, but we could use, say, 20 of those minutes to continue our proceedings here.
We normally do on this committee, Scott. We'll go to probably within 5 minutes of the vote. We usually do. We're just next door.
All right, thank you.
So it's usually we get agreement, but we're a pretty agreeable committee here.
All right.
Except when it comes to voting on issues.
All right. Yeah, right.
So
you got to welcome the committee, teach them the rules.
Thank you all, Mr. Page. The floor is yours. I understand you have a presentation, and then we'll go to questions.
Thank you, Chair. It's nice to hear that the Finance Committee is an agreeable committee. Thank you, Chair, Vice Chairs, members of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance. It is an honor to be with you today. J'offre des brefs commentaires sur les projets.
We'll be providing some brief comments on Bill C-44, particularly with respect to the Parliamentary Budget Officer.
Released by the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, IFSD, at the University of Ottawa. They include both favorable and unfavorable observations. Bottom line, I think amendments are necessary. I'm heartened to hear that the government is open to changes. My perspective is premised on the basic need for senators and members of Parliament to have financial analysis when they vote on spending and tax legislation. Given the uncertainty around projections and cost analysis, we want additional data backed by analysis for parliamentarians. Canada's Parliament needs a strong and independent budget office. Je félicite le gouvernement de Canada d'avoir proposé.
I congratulate the Government of Canada for coming forward with a bill to strengthen the office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer.
Changes are favorable. The position will be an officer of Parliament. Parliament will have a role in the selection of the officer. The officer will now be dismissed for cause, as opposed to working at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. The mandate is being expanded to help political parties cost election platforms. Political parties struggle to find technical expertise to help them cost initiatives in their election platforms. Who better to do this than in a nonpartisan way than the PBO? It will not be easy to set up the protocols with the public service on information sharing and with parties on the release and the use of PBO analysis. But the benefits of a good process should be significant for parties and voters. This is a complicated endeavour that merits the careful consideration of parliamentarians. When I took the position as Parliamentary Budget Officer, few people with the requisite experience and skills wanted to be the PBO. During my mandate, there was confusion and tension around responsibilities and accountabilities. The officer position was situated in the Library of Parliament. There were administrative accountabilities to the Chief Librarian and mandate accountabilities to Parliament. Les amendements proposés par le gouvernement assureront.
The amendments put forward by the government will assure the accountability of the Parliamentary Budget Officer and will also encourage a greater number of candidates for the position.
Related to the proposed legislation. I argue that it is essential that 4 provisions of the proposed legislation be amended to better serve parliamentarians. They deal with purpose, mandate, independence, and access to information. Sans ces amendements, nous risquerons.
Without these amendments, we may wind up with an Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer that is weakened and less independent than it is currently.
Must align directly with the core mandate of Parliament. According to Robert Marleau and Camille Montpetit, two Canadian experts on parliamentary procedure, the direct control of national finance is the great task of modern parliamentary government. The House of Commons is given the power of the purse, and the PBO plays an indispensable role by providing decision support in the form of economic and fiscal analysis to improve the quality of debate and outcomes for Canadians. The legislation should reflect this type of language. It should be strengthened with the purpose at its core. With respect to mandate, the mandate in the proposed legislation is less clear and more restrictive than the current legislation. It should be clarified. Do senators and MPs want independent economic and fiscal forecasts and related analysis? Do MPs want help with costing and scrutiny of spending and tax legislation? What the PBO will do to serve Parliament should be spelled out in the law very clearly. For instance, the proposed legislation would no longer allow individual MPs to request costing analysis of government bills or procurement. Their request would be limited to support private member bills. During my time as the PBO, Parliamentary Budget Officer, we received important requests from MPs to cost wars, fighter planes, crime bills, amongst many others. There is no good reason to restrict this important function of the Parliamentary Budget Office. With respect to independence, independence for the Parliamentary Budget Officer or Office means being free from political and bureaucratic influence in its work and reporting. An independent Parliamentary Budget Officer should determine their work plan and undertake analysis within the mandate he or she deems important. In the same way, the Auditor General must undertake work in the audit of the public accounts. There should be no requirement to have work plans approved by speakers of the Senate and/or the House of Commons. This does not exist for the Auditor General. Given the frequency and volatility of economic information, it is also essential that the Parliamentary Budget Officer publicly release timely reports, even if this means that Parliament is not sitting. The proposed legislation would restrict reporting to only when Parliament is sitting. With respect to access to information, in my experience, governments in the public service do not like to provide information that will be used to strengthen accountability. You must ask yourselves if you want to strengthen the information provisions according to the Parliamentary Budget Office or Officer. What if the government and public service refuses to provide essential information that the Budget Officer requires to serve you in your capacity to undertake financial due diligence? Should there be sanctions? Should the PBO have recourse to a federal court? In closing, I want to make a plea for this Parliament to see the strengthening of the Parliamentary Budget Officer and Office as a beginning and not an end. Our estimate system is badly broken. There
is not enough analysis done on the billions of dollars spent by legislation and by credits. Our financial system requires better alignment between expenditures and the budget.
It is a privilege to be here and a privilege to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Page. We'll turn to 5-minute questions, I believe, because we'll be operating on limited time. Mr. Ouellette, first up.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Mr. Page, pour être ici. So I was just...
Mr. Page, for coming here.
Accountability. I wanted to talk about that for a little bit. So under the Westminster model, accountability is very important. And I believe the Parliamentary Budget Office should be a tool not only of Parliament and in consequence parliamentarians, but also in consequence following that of Canadians. And so I was just wondering, you just said, what the PBO will do, the question you asked is what the PBO will do to serve Parliament should be spelled out in law. And so how can you actually be accountable in any proposed legislation to actual parliamentarians? How do you then actually respond to the needs of parliamentarians? And that's my most important thing, not to governments, but to parliamentarians? How can you respond to the needs that I ask of you in the work that I need to see happen so I can hold the government to account? Because you're not, I don't believe the PBO is here is to replace parliamentarians in their role. You're here to assist me so I can hold, or the opposition in this case, can hold government to account.
Thank you, Chair. An excellent question. I think you're absolutely right. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has no accountability per se to Canadian citizens. That accountability, the accountability of holding the executive to account rests solely with individual MPs, and this committee plays a very important role. I think how that operates, how the requests are provided to the Parliamentary Budget Office, how they are prioritized. Are they prioritized on materiality? Are they prioritized on risk? Really is how that function is played out. I think a lot of this operating model exists outside of legislation, but I think the mandate plays a very critical role. Like, what is the scope of duties that the Parliamentary Budget Officer and office will provide to you? And again, it should be clearly laid out in terms of those specific products. And I think as well, the individual relationships to committees, those relationships to committees, they should be spelled out in legislation, and that role of the Parliamentary Budget Officer to individual MPs as well.
But I guess you also said an independent Parliamentary Budget Officer should determine their work plan and undertake analysis within the mandate he or she deems important. So how can you be accountable if already the basis point is what you deem to be important? So how, and I guess my question is, what would you actually like to see, or what suggestions would you make to the legislation, changes would you make to the legislation in order that you actually be accountable to parliamentarians, so you empower the individual MPs to hold the government to account?
Yeah, I think I think obviously a Parliamentary Budget Office, the Auditor General, any officer of Parliament is going to prepare a work plan. And it will be forward-looking, and as the sessions progress, initiatives are brought forward. The Parliamentary Budget Officer will make decisions, just like the Auditor General makes decisions on what to audit this year, next year, and future years. But it's a decision, I think you want the Parliamentary Budget Officer to be a regular feature here. I was a regular feature at this committee, at the Senate Committee, Public Accounts, Operations and Estimates Committee. So we will bring the work here. The Parliamentary Budget Office will bring that, the work here. I think you want to make sure that you have that opportunity to talk, is this work authoritative? Is it high quality work? You make the decision whether you use the work or not. In the same way we ask the Auditor General, we hold the Auditor General accountable of the quality of their work, we would do the same. I think one feature that is not in the legislation that does exist in other legislations is a review function of the Parliamentary Budget Officer in office. I was somebody that was asked to review the Office of Budget Responsibility in the UK. It is actually built into legislation. So like a 5-year process where we build into the review, or maybe 7 years in the case of the change in the tenure of this office, I think would be a good addition as well. But again, when the work that was done during my tenure and the work done by Mr. Fichette, the current Parliamentary Budget Officer, all the work that they do is made available to Canadians. There's complete transparency.
Time for one short. Okay, Mr. Leipert.
I guess I have a bit of a different view than my colleague across the way. And so I'd like your opinion on whether you feel the Parliamentary Budget Office works on behalf of us as members of Parliament or on behalf of Canadian taxpayers.
Actually, that was a question that we debated significantly in the early months. I think ultimately, Parliament works for Canadians. And, I think when we actually do our work and the way we release the work, we want to feel that we're also working for Canadians, but we work through you.
Well, yes, but we have seen in many cases where Parliament doesn't actually work on behalf of Canadians, and I think that that's why we have roles like yours, like the Auditor General and others that are independent, that whoever the government is and however they choose to work with opposition and other members of Parliament, you're kind of that independent, which can, and so that leads me to another question. I'd like your view on this, because you're here as part of this legislation. Do you feel you should be here testifying as part of the consideration of the Budget Implementation Act, or do you feel that with your experience as a parliamentary budget officer, you should be here maybe testifying before a special committee to look at the role of the Parliamentary Budget Officer and not get buried within the Implementation Act.
I think a good question, Chair. Thank you very much for the question. This discussion around, is this an omnibus bill? Are there parts here that don't flow directly from the budget, that don't have policy cover from the budget? Would there be a better, longer, more fulsome discussion so all political parties would be more comfortable with the legislation if we pulled, the section out that deals with the Parliamentary Budget Office? I think that's a fair question. I would be supportive of that if, people around this table thought, yeah, we could, we would benefit from a more fuller conversation. But just back to your earlier question, sir. Independence does not mean that the Parliamentary Budget Office usurps the role of parliamentarians. It works through parliamentarians.
No, understand that for sure. So if we were to propose that we looked at this in a separate committee, I'd be interested to know from your experience who we could call as witnesses who would have a good sense of what the Parliamentary Budget Office could do differently, to how could we strengthen it, those sorts of things. I know you work with the civil service, but in your time, what other entities would you find yourself working with that were helpful in coming up with your reports?
Well, sir, Chair, thank you for the question. It's there's been a significant development. There's in the international community around building legislative budget offices or international independent fiscal institutions. So the OECD has led the way. In the report that we provided to you, talks about principles for establishing these types of offices. They would be having some witnesses that could speak from the OECD experience. Almost every country in the OECD now has one of these offices. They could provide, I think, a very useful service to this committee or another committee. I think the International Monetary Fund has been very supportive of the development of these independent fiscal institutions. They have done macro type of analysis on the benefits of these things. They can share their work. The World Bank is actively playing in amongst a number of communities. I'm part of that development. African communities, Caribbean communities, Southeast Asian communities. So if there was a willingness to reach out to the international communities, I'm sure they would love to be here.
I'm good, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Leipert. Mr. Page, Mr. Belarus.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to say that it's most unfortunate that we're going to be changing the mandate of the PBO in the Budget Implementation Act, because apart from the word budget, there's no relevance here. That being said, Mr. Page, at the outset, I would like to thank you for all the work that you accomplished when you were the Parliamentary Budget Officer. It was appreciated by all citizens in Canada. There are some things that we've never seen in the changes that have been put forward by the current government, including, for example, the fact that the PBO has to submit an annual work plan. I understand it's normal to be able to look ahead and see what type of work and research has to be done, but in your opinion, do you think that will limit the ability of the PBO to initiate throughout the year investigations on events that could crop up that were not foreseen initially?
An excellent question. I do think that, first of all, I think, again, it's just a good practice. I would expect that an independent officer of Parliament would be preparing work plans. I don't think, again, as I've noted, I don't think these things should be approved by the speakers. I think I could easily envisage cases, even in the current environment, where the PBO may decide to do investigations on sensitive files. They could be, sensitive files leading up to an election. And I could see a speaker, certainly the Speaker of the House is a political person, may decide that this should not be part of the work plan, would not approve it. I'm also quite aware that there are some of my colleagues, Department of Finance, don't like the fact that the Parliamentary Budget Officer produces independent economic and fiscal projections, and they could put pressure on the speakers to take this out of the work plan. I think you could already see in the language of the legislation that there seems to be a willingness not to want the Parliamentary Budget Office to do proactive work. I think you want, a Parliamentary Budget Officer to do this type of work, so not wait for MPs to say we need to look at this, to provide this analysis to MPs and to Canadians. So I do think it would be very restrictive, potentially very restrictive, if the Speaker was responsible for signing off.
Je vous remercie beaucoup pour votre réponse.
Thank you for your response. I feel that you are afraid that the office will become politicized with these changes that have been forward by the government. But this is a hypothetical question. We're dealing with a black hole here. If the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer submits the work plan to the Speakers of the House of the Commons and the Senate, what would happen if they were to say no?
If the Speaker said no to a work plan to the Parliamentary Budget Officer taking an initiative, I could answer what I would do. And I'm not sure I could answer what the future Parliamentary Budget Officer would do. It would create a lot of tension and create some controversy, and I think that would be unnecessary. And quite frankly, I'm not even sure the current Speaker would want to have that, be the proverbial meat in the middle of the sandwich.
You get time for another question.
Okay.
And what do you think about the fact that we're cutting back on the opportunities for parliamentarians to ask questions to the PBO if it's not related to a motion or a bill? This is a limitation, a tremendous restriction on the relationship between parliamentarians and the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer.
As I said in my opening remarks, I think it would be an enormous restriction on the mandate. And I look back at the 5 years while I was the Parliamentary Budget Officer and the work that the office did. And some of our biggest files, on fighter planes, on costing ships, on crime bills, these initiatives were costing the Afghanistan war. They all came to us from individual MPs. I think breaking that connection would be a mistake.
Thank you both. We've got time for about 3 minutes here. Mr. Fergus, go ahead.
D'abord, merci beaucoup, Monsieur Page.
Thank you, Mr. Page, for appearing and testifying before our committee. I must confess that I've been a big fan of questions regarding Parliament for 30 years, and I'd like to congratulate you on the work that you've done. And I'd also like to congratulate the former government for having created the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer. I think that it's a very important office. It's an incredible tool. And as the first PBO, you really created something. You had the tools that were given to you to do that job. And it wasn't always it didn't always make the government at that time happy, but as a Canadian citizen, I feel that the work that you did was very important, and this continues with your successor. My question pertains to the relationship between the OPBO and parliamentarians. As a parliamentarian, if I were to ask you to focus on a given issue, based on what I read from your quotes in the newspaper, you feel that this is that this work should be made public 24 hours a day, or soon after you've presented the information to the MP. What's my recourse as an MP if I want to control the information? Perhaps I don't want the info to be released right away. Maybe the timing's not right. Maybe I don't want the results or findings known right away. You initially were from the Library of Parliament. What do you think? What impact will this have?
A great question. I think it's very important that the Parliamentary Budget Officer and office has a strong relationship with individual MPs and should spend as much time as possible understanding that their needs and the kind of questions that they have. I think, the practice that we put in play early in my first mandate was when we sat down with an individual MP, there would be a discussion on the nature of the work. And we found out that often in this work that we can't answer all the questions that individual MPs wanted. Our toolbox is limited to a finite set of tools, economic tools, fiscal tools, costing tools. And we would make it pretty clear that in some cases we take on a project potentially costing a war, which is the very first project that Mr. Doer asked us to do. We would spend 2 to 3 months costing that war. Like, what is the cost of having soldiers in Afghanistan? What was the cost of capital, the depreciation of capital, the disability, death costs, and developmental costs? We would work with peer reviewers in different parts of the world, and Canada included. Again, if we came to the point that we came out with a report that the individual MP said, well, thank you very much, but don't release it, I think it would undermine the independence of the office, and I think it would really be very disruptive to the kind of work that we would do. I think you want the Parliamentary Budget Officer and office to be as independent as possible, and transparency is again one of those fundamental principles that the OECD highlights in the release of its documents. But I think it's very important that we also have a strong research service in the Library of Parliament that provides the day-to-day kind of briefing, confidential services. So I think you need both.
With that, we will have to suspend. I wonder, can you stay, Mr. Page, for probably 10-15 more minutes? We'll try to go with 45 minutes with yourself and 45 minutes with the current Parliamentary Budget Officer. So we'll suspend until after the vote.
Folks, grab their seats, please, and we'll try and resume because we may have another break here very shortly. I'd just like to draw to the attention of members that Mr. Khan has now arrived. Is there anything you would like to say, or are you just here to supplement Mr. Page?
Thank you for your. Yeah, I'm here to supplement Mr. Page, and I apologize. I was at the Senate National Finance Committee at the same time.
No, we certainly understand that, but you have nothing that you want to raise at the outset.
No, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
So then we're going to continue the line of questioning, and the chair said you were done.
3 minutes, and I had
And he
2
said
more.
you used 4.
I recall him saying 3 minutes, and there were 2 minutes left, but I could be wrong.
Okay,
Forgive
I'll
me.
give you about a minute. How's that?
All right, Mr. Chair, I'm always in your good, capable hands. Thank you. Mr. Page, thank you once again. Quickly, the other question is that I'd have is in terms of the work plans. I clearly understand the criticism as to why you would not want to have the work plans to be submitted to the speakers. I could see how that could, you leave yourself open, or that we leave the position open for any type of, unfortunate political control. But how is there a way that we can ensure that not you, not the current PBO, but perhaps some future PBO ends up just ragging the puck and doing things which are not relevant to Canadians? How do we ensure that the work plans then are going to be working towards questions which are relevant and of importance to Canadians and can help parliamentarians in doing their work and evaluating what the real costs are of us doing business?
Sir, thank you, Chair, for the question. Again, another excellent question. I think it's very important that the legislation be as clear as possible on what you want the Parliamentary Budget Officer to do. So if it's, you want to see economic and fiscal projections 2 times a year, you want to see fiscal sustainability analysis.
And while you're answering that question, does legislation do that now?
Yeah, unfortunately, to get right to your answer, no, it does not spell it out that clearly right now. In other legislations that have survived, for example, the Congressional Budget Office in the United States, it has that level of specificity in it. So I think so having a really clear mandate is very important. I think it's like there's absolutely a good practice. I think that with respect to the work plan, it should be submitted to the speakers, to the various committees. But again, the question really becomes on the approval. Like, do you want the control of the work plan to lie with the speakers? I don't think you do. You're saying no. I would agree. Is that here?
Yeah. Mr. Fergus, I also want to add, the OECD lays out a number of principles Mr. Page may have brought up about how independent fiscal institutions should operate. They put a premium on the value of leadership. You asked about what are the risks. Well, I think parliamentarians lower the risk when they pick a qualified person with the expertise and the reputation, something at stake. I think if the right choice is made in leadership of the Parliamentary Budget Office, parliamentarians then are assuming less risk for someone doing work that isn't responsive and relevant to the work of parliamentarians and Canadians.
All right, Mr. Albus.
Mr. Chair, and I certainly want to thank Mr. Khan and Mr. Page for your presence here today, for stimulating minds on both sides of the Rideau Canal. I think that's very important with the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Now, Mr. Page, earlier you said in your remarks to my colleague, Mr. Lightbert, that there are different people that we could bring in to come and talk about, because what we are talking about is the Parliamentary Budget Office, not the Government Budget Office. Because I do think that the government has in this bill, it's an omnibus bill, so there's lots of measures in it, with very little consultation. I would say no consultation, at least that I'm aware of, has suddenly added a sprinkling of different measures, given very little explanation, and now that there is some resistance from even from the Parliamentary Budget Office themselves, saying that the proposed amendments may not be in the office best interest, nor in parliamentary's best interest. So, would an alternative process be better? Would it be better for us to actually literally cut this out of the bill, and perhaps have a joint session of 2 committees of both houses, or have a special committee where both houses, because this involves Parliament. This is an institution that would become an office of Parliament, sir. So do you think that the process of 2 hours of examination here and the debate you've heard thus far on this bill is really going to do this institution and future officer of Parliament position justice?
No, sir, I'll be direct. I don't think a couple of hours would do the legislation justice. I think, as we discussed here today, there's a need for amendments. There's stuff that we haven't even talked about yet, like the process for costing opposition party manifestos or party platforms. And again, to get back to your point, I think we could, if a fulsome discussion, or a full discussion that brought in colleagues from the Netherlands or Australia, where they actually do this, could bring about refinements perhaps to the legislation, and could confirm to your minds what the operating model would be. So, yeah, I think you need more than a few hours. And if the committee thought that this was a good idea to pull it apart so we can come, all MPs could benefit better from the Parliamentary Budget Office, I'd be very supportive of that. But again, that's your decision, not mine.
So do we know in other cases, officers of Parliament, for example, the Auditor General, have you heard of any kind of work plans that need to be approved by the speakers in both houses? Have you heard of that?
No, it's not in the legislation. The Auditor General does not require the speakers to approve their work plans, though again, the Auditor General, the Office of the Auditor General provides work plans on what they feel based on their lenses, usually risk and materiality, what their forecasts, projections for when they will complete reports over a 4-year cycle.
Okay, so this is not being asked of any of the other officers of Parliament you know of, even the Office of the Environment Commissioner?
Yeah, I think, again, the idea of producing a work plan is a great idea. It should be produced. Again, do you want the speakers to, to have final say, control over what's in that work plan or not? That's the point of contention for me. I don't think we do.
Do you think the government has done a proper job, or do you think that this is literally, and by the minister even saying we are open to amendments, I think means that he knows that his own office or his own department did not do the proper work of consulting, and have to make changes in light of it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, but again, to be honest, I compliment the government on saying that they are open to amendments. And I'm somebody that's been in the financial community since 1980-ish, and it's rare to see governments open to amendments on budget implementation bills. So that by itself, I find as a positive. Would more consultation help bring consensus around this committee of where the kind of parliamentary budget office you want now in the future? I think it will.
Okay. Well, just to get this on the record, Mr. Chair, we're in favor of seeing this become a full office of Parliament. However, given the process that we have and given the large amount of amendments that are going to be necessary, we do think that everyone would be in best interest to pull back, to form a special committee, or to perhaps have a joint session of two different committees of both houses, and then introduce it as a first reading so that the committee can actually get into making amendments as they're necessary before we have second reading. And the reason, Mr. Chair, just for that, on that point though, is that we want to see the institution become a full office, but we also want to make sure there's proper independence, and that we've had the discussion with the international community, we've had the discussion with all parliamentarians before moving forward.
Okay, you are on the record, Ms. Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Page, for staying. And I appreciate your comments in regards to our government's commitment and acknowledgement of amendments. I certainly see my role as a committee member here today is to listen to testimony and consider whether or not we need to put forward amendments. So that's where I'm kind of basing my questions here today. You mentioned in your own opening statement, and just now you also acknowledged the fact that there are other things we need to talk about in this proposed legislation. So I'm going to talk about something that you touched on but we haven't talked yet about. That's the access to information and the recourse for that. You mentioned very briefly about the opportunity for the PBO to go to a federal court. And I just want to ask in regards to if this were to be something to be included, how do you see that process? Do you have any have you envisioned a process, or do you think the PBO should go straight to federal court if they feel they haven't received the proper information?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, no, I don't think the PBO should go directly to a federal court if it doesn't get the information. Certainly, like in my experience as a parliamentary budget officer, we ran into significant problems getting information from public servants that was very important to bring forth to you, to members of a committee like this. I think there is a process. I think a notification that, and again, the practice that we had in place, it's still in place. When we need information to serve you, we would go write a letter and explain that this is a request from an MP. We would send that letter to the accountability office of the department. We get a response back. Often we got a response back saying we're not going to give you that information. In one case, following Budget 2012, we had the whole basically government said they were not going to give us their fiscal plans for Budget 2012, the departmental spending plans. And so again, after many requests, multiple requests, and going to the committee as well, raising this, we eventually decided we needed, and members of the government of the day was saying that you're exceeding your mandate. We went to the federal court on a reference opinion. But in the current legislation, if you pull up federal court, you'll see that this privilege would be taken away from the parliamentary budget officer, even as a last resort. But I think, again, you want to get a process here that, with a series of steps that are elevated, that of notification, of involvement of MPs, eventually maybe even potentially going to the federal court. You could even consider sanctions. If the accountability officer is saying, you know what, we're not going to give you this information, again, you cannot do your job. Your job is absolutely vital to this country. You could potentially, I could see a sanction on an accountability officer. A deduction of pay, a removal of the job, because it's fundamentally important that you get this information.
Thank you. I appreciate that explanation. And then in addition to that, and frankly, there may even be a necessity in some cases, whether it's an issue of cabinet confidentiality or national security, but at least having that rationale, I would think, as to why the information isn't going to be released is important. And that somewhat leads into my next question in regards to some language or concerns around information that the PBO might receive in the course of its work, and then whether or not they can release that information or not, like the information they've received, not their full report. Is this an area of concern for you? Is this an area where you feel amendments are needed, or are you comfortable with the language?
I mean, again, I think it goes back to what Mr. Khan said, that if you have an experienced budgetary official, leading the office, they would be quite familiar of, the rules and restrictions around personal information, around solicitor-client information, around cabinet confidence, access to information. Like I'm certainly Mr. Khan as well. Like we spent many, many years at the Privy Council office dealing with these sorts of issues. Like we haven't had a problem like that. But there could even be, like in the context of a more full discussion around what should be made available to the parliamentary budget officer. We never asked to see, specific details, cabinet type of documents, Treasury Board documents from officials on various costing. I don't actually think we need to see that, but it's possible that individual MPs here think, well, actually, we want a parliamentary budget officer to see this type of information. So again, this committee like this could go, delve into that issue. Perhaps Mr. Khan wants to add to this.
Yeah, just to echo Mr. Page's comments. I mean, we received information in some cases that was classified from a security point of view. We knew how to handle it. And we're fortunate to say in our 5 years we didn't have a leak of such information. So it is about establishing appropriate protocols. I don't think in our time in the Parliamentary Budget Office we were ever asking for information that was. There might be a debate as to whether something is a cabinet confidence, and again, there are protocols for that. You could ask the clerk to certify that something is a cabinet confidence. And so there are ways to escalate, but also to reflect back on your question on the federal court, hopefully it never comes to it. But if there is recourse, the incentives for people, actors within the system, are likely to be a little more positive towards sharing of information than if everyone knows at the end of the day there is no recourse for the PBO. And I think that's maybe one way to look at this federal court recourse, is that it's hopefully rare. If you get to that, you're dealing with a pretty serious issue, and I imagine by then parliamentarians are probably quite exercised about it anyways.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop you there and go to Mr. Diltel.
Mr. Page, Mr. Khan, be welcome to your House of Commons Committee. Monsieur Page, c'est un grand plaisir, un honneur pour moi de pouvoir discuter directement avec vous.
Mr. Page, it was great to be able to discuss matters with you. My question is very simple. You assumed your functions with a great deal of dignity. What problems do you think you experienced that could be resolved through our legislative process to help the PBO?
The vision or the kind of parliamentary budget office they want. And so I think the more you can go through on a clause-by-clause basis, does this capture the purpose? Is this the precise mandate that we want? Are these the kinds of reports that we want to see every year from the parliamentary budget officer? What are the relationships to committees? What are the relationships to individual MPs? What are the qualifications the individual PBO? The more that you can get comfortable with that, I think this legislation, once it's done, could last decades before it needs to be changed, as we've seen in other countries. So I think getting as comfortable as possible that you understand the modus operandi of this office would be I think the best use of this committee.
Tabling your work plan for a full year at the office of the Speaker of the House and the Speaker of the Senate was not a thing to steer or to change, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there are some very specific amendments that we propose. That the current parliamentary budget officer has a very similar set of amendments. That is clearly one, where around work plans and the speakers. But again, I think I would as a parliamentary budget officer. I struggle with the legislation right from reading the purpose. Right from the very get-go, it's there's platitudes around this is good for transparency, this is good for accountability. Actually, you cannot do your job You cannot do your financial due diligence job without a parliamentary budget office. You need to see this information. You need to have costings. You should have second data points. So, like, right to the very purpose, this is fundamental core to what you do as individual MPs. And then I would go from beyond that. So I think there is an opportunity to make significant amendments to the legislation.
Significant amendments. What kind of?
Well, I think, again, I would, clearly lay out the purpose. I would more clearly specify the mandate. I would be very particular on the qualifications of the budget officer that you want. I think on the information provisions, we just heard questions. I think you need to get to a point where you know right now, how will you handle those situations when the government of the day, perhaps a year or two before an election, says we're not giving you the information? Like, what will be the, what is that protocol? I would work through these various types of scenarios. And again, I would build in a review function for this office. So after 5 or 7 years, you'd have an external review of the office. Is it performing its function? So, yeah, it's living up to, to your needs. So yeah, these are specific things. We've drafted language around the Budget Implementation Act. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, the current Parliamentary Budget Officer, has done the same. So I mean, we have a good starting point.
But there is have a work plan to be adopted or vetoed by the Speaker of the Senate.
No, absolutely not, sir. I would. There's a need to have a work plan. There's a need to have an annual report. But I think it would politicize the office if the Speaker of the day, particularly of the House of Commons, who is an elected member, appointed to that position, decide, I don't, under a lot of pressure, says, I wouldn't want the Parliamentary Budget Office today doing this, following this set of work. It would be not advantageous. Then I think you take away the independence of the office. And
why do you point out specifically the Speaker of the House of Commons? Because he's elected. Do you think the Speaker of the Senate, who is appointed directly by one person in Canada, which is, by the way, the Prime Minister of Canada, do you think he has more authority than the Speaker of the House of Commons?
No, I should have mentioned both, sir. Your point is well taken. In my own experience, like within the first few months, after we released the first few reports, I was getting, letters from the Speaker, both speakers, like they were, were really concerned about our operating model. Eventually, at the end of my tenure, we went into a federal court on the opposite side of this, this reference opinion. We were literally going to federal, getting this reference opinion with the speakers on the other side of the fence, arguing that we shouldn't be seeking this type of an opinion from the federal court. So I think, again, it risks politicizing the office.
Okay. You want to...
Simplement un mot en français pour conclure. Yeah, Monsieur Page, merci.
Mr. Page, I'd like to thank you for the services that you have provided to Canada. You know that the party I represent didn't always agree with your reports, but it was a democratic exercise, and you had a vision, and I'm very proud of the services that you provided to Canada.
Page and Mr. Khan for being here today. Mr. Page, I'm going to go back to the original question. In your opinion, the mandate of the PBO, is it to work for parliamentarians in Parliament, or is it for Canadians?
Well, I mean, I think it works for parliamentarians. But I think when we were drafting reports, we wanted to write them in a way that all Canadians could read the reports. So effectively, you're working for both. And you do not want to work in a partisan way. So in that sense, you feel like you're working for what is best for the country. Mr. Khan?
Yeah, we did a great deal of consultation in the initial time in the PBO, and we heard from a number of members of parliamentarians that it's very important to reach Canadians. Financial and economic language is not the language of politics necessarily, so that there was a very important kind of education opportunity to ensure that our work was accessible, that we were explaining it to people. And a number of MPs from all parties said if our constituents can appreciate and understand the material, it'll reflect back to us, and then we can use it, and we start to get a filter of what's important to us. So we learned over time that it's very important that parliamentarians are very close to their constituents, and that we should actually consider that they both matter.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't disagree with you at all. I think it's, democracy functions best when parliamentarians are the voice of the people. I just wanted to know, on the costing of political parties' platforms, it's a great tool to give Canadians an independent verification of what a party is campaigning on, so that a party can't just say that we're going to give everybody $100 a day and balance the books. I think it's extremely important. So there's other countries, Australia and Netherlands, have this already put into place. You mentioned, Mr. Page, when the question was asked by my colleague, that it'd be very labor intensive. In what terms, in what way do you see the PBO being able to carry out this function? And there's got to be certain sort of framework, as in the platform is submitted to the PBO, X number of days before a writ period, ensure that, they all come out on the same day. So it wouldn't be that, if party A submitted and then theirs was released, party B submitted, and party C's was released like 2 days before the campaign, and that the costing, in my humble opinion, this would have to be done before the writ period, so it doesn't impact the decisions or isn't like the October surprise in a Canadian election.
Yeah, so I wouldn't imagine, thank you, Chair, I wouldn't imagine that the Parliamentary Budget Officer or office is going to do much sleeping before, the election and before the writ is dropped. So you would need to have a process that had all of what you described. In addition, you'd have to have relationships with all the key departments so that you would have access to data and models. You would, you'd have to expect that the Parliamentary Budget Officer and officials in the Parliamentary Budget Office would be spending time with the political parties, understanding the proposals. More often these proposals would not be defined in such a way that you could do real analysis. There'd have to be stipulations around when you release these reports, how that analysis is presented before they use that stamp of the Parliamentary Budget Office.
I just want to add that, when we look at the Australian model, the PBO does a great deal of kind of confidential work for political parties during the year. And so by the time you get to a writ period, they actually have kind of a book, a costing book that's kind of been done confidentially for MPs. That's a particular way to do this work. It's one modality. But it also runs kind of in conflict with what the OECD guidelines are for independent fiscal institutions, to which Canada is a signatory, that says work should be not confidential, that it should be released simultaneously to all parties. So it is, as Mr. Page has said, the modalities kind of matter, and this committee probably has a stake in how that new obligation of the PBO is actually discharged. I will also add that there's always an element of risk. Some of the major costing reports that we did for parliamentarians, like the F-35 fighter jet, take months to undertake. That's if you get the data. In that case, we didn't have it. It took a little longer, but we still did it. The issue is that may not always kind of dovetail with, electoral processes.
Mr. I have to end it there, and thank Mr. Page, Mr. Khan. And what I would ask committee members is please stay in your seats, because we're going to have the presentation by the Parliamentary Budget Officer first, and then we'll break for a vote. So thank you again, gentlemen. And if I could have the group come up as quickly as you can, and we'll do the presentation before we break. Pardon? Mr. Frechette, I'm not going to do the introductions. If you want to introduce your team, please go ahead. But we've got about, let's say, 6 minutes for the presentation. If we don't get finished, we'll have to come back, but I leave it up to you.
Thank you. I'll go quickly to my remarks. Merci, Monsieur le Président, Monsieur Vice-Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Vice Chairs, and members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to address the changes to the PBO's mandate and operations as set out in Bill C-44. You have in your hands a discussion paper that outlines the major implications these changes could have on the PBO's effectiveness and ability to provide services to members of the Senate and House of Commons.
In the introduction, the new mandate is well written and respects the spirit of the PBO's role, as evidenced in new section 79.01. And I read, quote, Section 79.1 to 79.5 provide for an independent and non-partisan PBO to support Parliament by providing analysis, including analysis of macroeconomic and fiscal policy, for the purposes of raising the quality of parliamentary debate and promoting greater budget transparency and accountability, end of quote. The paradox comes later when the bill imposes restrictions on this independence. In addition to undermining the PBO's ability to effectively and efficiently respond to Parliament's requests, the most restrictive restrictions include, first, the degree of control that the speakers of the Senate and the House of Commons will be expected to exercise over the Office of PBO's activities. Second, the limits of the PBO's ability to initiate reports and members' ability to request cost estimates of certain proposals. Third, the risk flowing from the PBO's involvement in preparing cost estimates of election proposal. And finally, the restrictions on the PBO's access to and disclosure, this is important, of information and the lack of an effective remedy for refusals to provide access to information. I see no problem in submitting a work plan to the speakers. However, a PBO would become the only officer of Parliament to require the approval of both speakers for his or her annual work plan. It seems clear to me that this will place considerable pressure on the two speakers, particularly in regards of their neutrality, even more so during an election year, especially in the absence of a joint committee that has yet to be created. Furthermore, if one adds to that obligation that the direction and control of the office of the PBO and its officers is vested in the speakers, it is easy to see how time-consuming it could become for them and their own administration. That is why I'm fairly confident that this aspect of the bill will be reviewed and revised by the government. Le libellé actuel de l'alinéa 79.
The current wording of paragraph 79.21F, which deals with the freedom of any member of the Senate or House of Commons to request an estimate of the financial cost of any proposal, can be interpreted in more than one way and should be clarified. So lastly, with respect to access to information, the absence of any mention of a remedy in the event of a refusal suggests that it will be up to the two speakers to intervene in the event that a department or agency refuses to provide information requested by the PBO, or refuse that that the latter publicizes or releases information. And I would also like to say that this would be a challenge to both the speakers and to the people surrounding them, and it would have an impact on parliamentary privilege. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Remarks? We have only 5 minutes, so I think we will now break and ask committee members to please get back here as quickly as you can after the vote.
We'll reconvene and welcome again, and thanks for staying, folks. Starting, we'll go with 5-minute rounds. Mr. Sabara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your patience, gentlemen. Very much appreciated. Get organized here myself. First, a general comment. As a new MP, I've been here, I guess, 16 months or 17 months, whatever it is now, or 18 months. Thank you, my colleague. The PBO to me is an indispensable tool in what I do as a parliamentarian. I know it was set up under a prior government, and then kind of, I'm going to use my own words, but had its wings clipped a few times and it's restrained. And we've now come out with some new legislation that I think improves it. Our House leader has stated in the House that there welcome some amendments and so forth. So for me, the PBO again is something I utilize frequently. I look forward to your reports and read them, and they allow me to do my job in a more effective manner. Absolutely. So thank you for that, and thank you for your service. My question relates to some of the proposed legislation in terms of making the PBO an independent officer of Parliament. How important is that component?
How important it is?
Yes,
it's very important because as a function that provides services to parliamentarians, it is important for the capacity of an independent officer of Parliament to provide transparency, to be honest and open in terms of providing information to these parliamentarians on a non-partisan basis, and also to have a positive relationship with the public service. I think that the culture of the public service will have to have some evolution in terms of accepting what the parliamentary budget officer is doing for the parliamentarians, and thus the importance of independence.
Okay. And I've read the report that was issued on the 3rd of May, 2017, on the reforms of the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer put out by your office, which listed some concerns in terms of the legislation. And I do want to ask, in terms of the concerns that you've outlined, on the concern number 2, limits the PBO's ability to initiate reports and members' ability to request cost estimates of certain proposals. Can you just elaborate on that just a little bit more in terms of what your views on that concern are?
There are different parts to that part of the legislation. In Part A of the mandate, it's very prescriptive in the sense that it actually stipulates that the PBO can provide assessment of very specific government documents, and there are 4 mentioned in the legislation. Now, that to us is very restrictive because during a year outside the budget cycle, the government may actually table other documents on other programs that they may decide to propose. And that part of the legislation essentially prevents PBO from providing a fiscal or economic assessment of those documents. The other part of that, the mandate, which really relates to the right of the members of Parliament and senators to request PBO to do studies. And the language that is there right now, in fact, restricts any request by members of Parliament to ask the PBO to do costing of government programs. Because the way that this is worded right now, it's only on the issues that the members are considering to propose, rather than the proposals that are done by the government. So that's also restrictive.
So how much time? So on that point there, so for example, we introduced the groundbreaking and transformational Canada Child Benefit. The PBO did an analysis on the costs of that. We've indexed the program, which is great, and it's going to reduce poverty by about 40% for children, which is also a historic measure for us. On that, with the existing legislation, to get the cost estimate of that would have to be a member of Parliament requesting that, if the legislation stays in as proposed, versus now that you can just go out and do it because it is a government piece of legislation.
No, in fact, under the proposed legislation, a member of parliament cannot ask us to do that costing. A committee can, but not a member of parliament or a senator. And we won't be able to do that costing on our own, because the only way we could have done that, or we could do that, it would be if it's part of our work plan, which means that we have to anticipate what the government is going to propose, which is again impossible.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Severa. Mr. Alves, 5-minute round.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank all of our witnesses today for the work you do for Canadians, particularly for parliamentarians. And on that note, I just would like ask a few questions. First of all, do you feel that 2 hours of study into this section of the bill is appropriate for the level of what we're doing here?
Is up to this. You are the legislators. I mean, it's not up to me to decide, if it's appropriate. It is. If the bill was easy, I mean, as I said in my opening remarks, there's some paradox in the bill. It seems to be written in two different ways. In one way to provide independence, and on the other way with a lot of restrictions. So I cannot say 2 hours, 4 hours, or whatever. I mean, I'm just saying it could be. There is something that has to be fixed in the bill to provide, a real independence to the
So
bill.
were you consulted on the nature of the changes presented in C-44 before they were tabled?
No. I mean, we were consulted in early 2016. We were asked to provide some kind of a draft legislation, our own vision, which we released in mid-summer because the document was leaked. Yeah. Since then, we have we didn't have any contact with anyone on the
Sir, you've done a great service, as your predecessor has done, to establish an institution that has built a reputation in this place. People take it seriously. The members around this table, and I would say in both houses, take it seriously. And so I ask you this question with the utmost sincerity. Do you feel that the process that has been undertaken here, no consultation with other political parties, massive changes, which some we may be in agreement with, but many that there are questions about the motives of the government. This is, again, a parliamentary budget office, not a government budget office. And with that being said, if the government makes unilateral changes, we've heard from them that they're open to amendments. I've seen BIAs come to this committee before and amendments put forward in all respects to do good things for Canadians have been washed and pushed aside in this place. Do you fear that a process that basically is implemented by one political party, the government, will put a strain on other political parties' perception of the independence of your office?
Well, right now, the way it's written, if it stays as it's written, clearly there are restrictions or perception that the independence is not always there. And this committee mentioned it with my predecessor just before. I mean, just the fact that the approval process provides these kind of restriction and limits the independence. Of course, there will be, some perception that maybe all the freedom to operate the office is not there, as well as, the control and direction of the office and its officers. There's a clause that says that it's going to be vested with the speakers. So I agree. I would say that yes, there's this risk that the perception will be that maybe all the work is not totally independent.
And again, if we only have an opportunity to have a small discussion here and then in the House of Commons before it moves on to the other place, I'm afraid that we are going to end up with something that it will not serve Canadians and will probably not get revisited. Your predecessor had spoken about the need to have a review, because even I would imagine your team would say that sometimes having a review of the reviewers can be a good thing. So again, I'll put it in different terms. Do you believe that an alternative process where parliamentarians can sit back, look at the history of your institution, but also look at the future of it becoming an office of Parliament, and then making sure you're truly independent, do you think that there could be a better process than the one that we are currently on?
It is, as I said, I will repeat myself, it's your privilege as legislators to decide that. It's not in my hands. I'm here to discuss, what the restriction may involve, what will be the limits of this bill. But you know, you are the legislators.
Okay.
I'm not an elected
Okay, I
person.
understand your point. I'm going to switch gears briefly, if I have time, just in the relations to the Mr. Graywall's comments earlier about the costing of political parties. Have there's been any discussion as to what that really means? Are we going to be asking for the Marxist-Leninist Party, the Libertarian Party to all submit? Is there going to be some narrow criteria where it's only on fiscal policy, or will you be asked to do more than that? And lastly, one point is that you're going to be asked to submit documents that will be the subject of elections when Parliament is dissolved. Do you feel that that puts your office and your office's reputation at possible politicization when you have documents and work when this place is closed and an election is on? Do you feel that that could put at risk the way your office is seen by the public?
I will just make a precision about clarification about what you said. The way it's written, it's not only the costing. It's not about the costing of platforms. It's about the costing of proposals. So basically, to answer your question, the PBO becomes, and which is a difference between the Liberal Party during the last election said that the proposal, the idea there was to ask the PBO to do platform costings, not proposal. Now the legislation talks only about proposals. That means that the PBO becomes some kind of a development policy agent developing policies, a policy development person, and that puts even more risk on the reputation of the PBO. And that's why we mentioned in our document that costing proposal is one thing, costing platforms are totally different things.
I think to go through that, we would need more time and a better process.
Thank you both, and that was outlined in your paper as well, I believe, JD. Mr. Belarus.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the outset, I'd like to underscore the fact that studying the changes made to the PBO as part of a study of the Budget Implementation Act poses a problem. The only thing that's of any relevance is the fact that the word budget is in both terms. But that being said, Mr. Frechette, welcome here, and Mr. Ascari and Mr. Mahabir. If I may, I would like to allude to the comments made by my Conservative colleague. The fact that the Liberal government is asking you to study the costs of proposals made by political parties during elections, that's already a very delicate issue at the outset. It might seem attractive to the public. They could ask for political parties to be accountable, but how? I'm preaching for my needs, but let's say we want to change the way we vote. How are you going to assess the cost of this proposal? With some difficulty, and with the assistance of the Chief Electoral Officer, who is afraid that this type of request would pop up during an election campaign. Indeed, what you're saying is quite true. If you read this brief, you can see that this is a very torturous process. The representatives can ask MPs to ask for information right up until the voting day, and also before the electoral period as well. So we're talking about the confidentiality here of political parties. This information can be public, but it has to be done in writing to the PBO. So once this information can get out on Facebook, on Twitter, so you can see that this game could be played. So once again, there's a risk where the PBO may be put in a position where it becomes a political office, or almost. In the changes that the Liberal government want to make, I have two questions, actually. You're being asked to submit an annual work plan. This annual work plan will be subject to the approval of the Speakers of the House of Commons and the Senate. Do you think that this annual work plan will restrict you, will prevent you from taking initiatives in the following year? Because you'll get new information during that year. And the way, because we don't find this as clear, what if the two speakers refuse your work plan, what happens then? It's not clear to me either. The legislation is not clear when it comes to that. And what about the time that the speakers can take to approve the work plan? You know very well that. Well, let's look at the example of the security services and the protective policing services. Well, you've got the two speakers involved. The legislation is not very clear about it, and the approval process was long. There's this. They're supposed to go before a joint committee, which doesn't exist yet. There was the Library of Parliament, which had not got itself on its feet. So this is a type of phenomenon that could arrive with this joint committee that could be established. And what I said in my opening remarks is that not only is this a long process, but it's a very complicated process, and there's not much information about the whole process as to be followed. And in your opinion, this annual work plan, subject to the approval of the speakers, do you think that may have an impact, may restrict you from initiatives that may come up during the course of the year? That's what we're worried about. I give you an example of the floods. How much money should we be setting aside for flood coverage and other disasters that may occur? I'm not convinced that we would be able to do this because we didn't foresee in January or in April that there would be a flood of this nature.
Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here today. I want to, in the 4 areas of concern that you specifically talk about, in regards to the concerns around the PBO's ability to initiate reports and members' ability to request cost estimates of certain proposals, do you feel that the current system works well? Is that what you would anticipate, or is there a different proposal or a different idea that you think would work well?
I will ask Mustafa, but my first comment on that is that certainly the current approach that we have provide more flexibility for parliamentarians. This one, right now, you're talking about the section F. Not only that, but you know, in the office, we're 5 of 6 of us. We're not even, and we don't even totally agree on the extent to where that clause could be, and the problem with that, and I think the leader of government in the House of Commons made a comment about it, is that there's no reference to any jurisdiction over which Parliament matter over which Parliament has jurisdiction, which means that you can ask for any kind of request that has no relationship with Parliament, and that will allow you to do it if you have a proposal that you consider making somewhere. I don't know if Mustafa wants to add something.
I think the issue is that currently, yes, we do have a lot of flexibility in terms of initiating reports that we believe would be useful for parliamentarians and the senators. And we have done that over the past 9 years, and we believe that they have been received well by the members and by the senators. There could be more probably details in terms of the mandate, how it should operate, but in terms of flexibility, certainly the current mandate that we are working under is actually quite flexible, and we are quite happy with that.
Thank you. And then following up on that, I mean, I've heard loud and clear in terms of the concerns around a work plan requiring approval from the speakers of both houses. But I get the sense that a work plan is quite normal and would be acceptable. And that might also provide on the transparency and accountability piece. Obviously, if your work plan has to deviate, and you used examples in terms of things that nobody could have predicted. However, from the parliamentarian side, and my colleague asked questions in the first round in regards to understanding whether or not parliamentarians' requests were actually being addressed, one could somewhat gauge where the work plan was and where it went. Is that something you're still comfortable with in terms of, let's put aside, because like I said, I've heard your concerns about the approval process, but still having that work plan so everybody can see what you generally plan on working on, and then if that deviates, kind of the rationale why?
First, it's a great comment that you're making there, because when we do our own work plan, we do have a work plan, an annual work plan. We and as you know, because we contribute to this committee on a regular basis twice a year, and even more so in other circumstances, we take that into consideration. We take into consideration how much time and resources we should dedicate to the Senate committees, because we also do some work, and for individual requests from parliamentarians, both senators and members of the House of Commons. So implicitly, we try to develop a work plan that is a balanced work plan. We will continue doing it, and even with, if we have comments from other people, which we do, I mean, we listen to people. I mean, we kind of in the fall we did NANA survey groups, exactly to know what with all stakeholders, parliamentarians, staffers, other independent agent of parliament, and public servant. And we learned from these lessons, and we applied some of those. For example, public service said that we don't announce in advance what we do and so on. Now, since this year, January, all our reports are announced on our site 3 months in advance. Everybody knows that in the next 3 months, tentative date, these reports will be public. So we do listen to parliamentarians. This is our job. We listen to all of them. We listen to the public service as well. So, I mean, as long as you have a balanced work plan, and, as I said, I have no problem to table a work plan, have a discussion with speakers of both chambers. The approval, I would prefer not, because that creates a real big restriction. Even more so, if I can add, during election time, can you imagine the two speakers the year of an election with a PBO's work plan that they will have to approve? And I will put that that year 50% of the resources will be dedicated to costing platforms. Not sure that the Senate speaker will be really, I don't know what's the word, but he will look at this as being, well, that's a lot of time that you spend on the other side.
Thank you both. So what I'm hearing, and I'll turn to Gerard next, Mr. Deltel. What I'm hearing is a work plan be provided for information, but should not be subject to approval by the speakers. That's what you're saying, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. Just in case we do have to run, I just wanted to make note, in the copies that members have of the PBO's remarks, you'll find a sheet in the center of it that shouldn't be there. It happened to be picked up on a photocopier, and just to explain it, it says extraction of all the tweets from the tweet manual chamber account. That did not come from the PBO. It relates to a matter that is being discussed on new communications for committees within, I guess, the Library of Parliament offices, right? Who's in the House offices? Okay. Anyway, just so you know, that's not from the PBO, and it's just trial tweets on another operation that's going on. Mr. Deltel.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, Monsieur Fréchette.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very happy to see you, Mr. Fréchette, Mr. Ascari, and Mr. Mahavir. Mr. Chair, at the outset, is the government, we can't attack a neutral institution such as the PBO by slipping in an omnibus a few paragraphs that fundamentally change the way that this institution is supposed to work. If the government wants to be serious in its desire to refresh the mandate of the PBO. He should set this bill aside, and we will deal with this issue and see where it leads. But as it's presented right now, it doesn't make sense. And I'm basing myself on the words used a few moments ago by my colleague from Rosemont-La Petite Patrie, by the PBO. It is tortuous. It's full of risk. It puts us, it puts the bureau in the position of being politicized, and we're supposed to have a neutral officer. But with this, we're talking about paragraphs that are slipped into an omnibus bus. This is an omnibus for sure, and yet the Liberals said throughout their election that they would never, ever present any omnibus buses, and I think that this is most unfortunate. Mr. Frechette, in various interviews, you have talked about the peril or that the PBO may be subject to a veto to a person who is appointed by the Prime Minister of Canada, namely the Speaker of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Commons. What risks will be put on, what risk will your office will be when you're dealing with someone who's been appointed by the Prime Minister? Indeed, what's important to understand is that the two speakers are neutral, technically speaking, and as you all know, they're not, one's elected by peers, the other is appointed by the PMO. That when I made these comments, I was saying that it would be a challenge. You have to, I'm not blaming the speakers. What I'm saying is that it's this challenge of being neutral is going to be at risk. And in this bill, the speakers are perceived as being ministers. Ministers are there to make decisions, to filter, to deal with government business. And so it's unfortunate that we've taken the two speakers and treated them as if they were ministers, when in fact that's not their role. Their role is to be neutral, to direct the works of the House of Commons and the Senate, and now they're asking them to deal with this huge challenge. And is there a greater risk coming from the Speaker of the Senate as opposed to the Speaker of the House of Commons? I would say that these roles are not the same in terms of administrative structure. I must confess, I'm speaking personally, when you look at the political platforms of the political parties, well, I must confess that when I think about this, and in conversations I've had with colleagues and exchanges that I had with my colleague from Rosemont-La Patrie, show just to what extent these proposals are grotesque and even dangerous for your independence, because you have to really keep yourself at a bay from any political dependencies. And during an election campaign, we're not objective. And I remember this debate that I had with the member from Rosemont-La Patrie, and once we were elected, well, we got along. Well, but that's the role we play. How a political party? How can a political party ask something of you like that? Listen, I'll answer you a question in a different way. Mr. Page referred to this. There are two entities in the world that do this. There's only one, the Australian office, that has a legislative mandate. The Netherlands does not have a legislative mandate. And perhaps this is a bad example there, because there are 12 political parties in the Netherlands. So you can understand this becomes a melting pot. In Australia, however, the PBO does this. He has to calculate the political platforms. He presents the report 30 days before the election, during the election period. 30 days after the election, he submits a report on all of the promises made by the political parties. Back in 2016, there were over 2,000 requests for cost calculations for proposals. He hired 50 additional people from the finance department in Australia who became permanent employees in his office. If the people in the public service were to give us 50 employees, I can tell you I'll be able to do this calculation. I'll be working on this on a permanent basis, and I'll do so happily.
We can take 3 more questioners at about 4 minutes, and then we'll call it a day. Mr. Fergus, Mr. Leipert, and Mr. Ouellette.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Director, or Mr. Frechette, I should say. It's a pleasure to have you here, appearing here. I've admired the work you do for a long time. I'd like to go back to the issue of I'd like to understand the way you see the evaluation of proposals regarding a political party during election time. But as the other witness who appeared, who said that he could assess or evaluate the cost association with an electoral platform, would you be in favor of that? If it's a process that was related to policy development, I would be more open to the suggestion. But that being said, it'd be very difficult for political parties. The election campaign was not too long ago, and ideas get thrown on the table on a regular basis. So it's very difficult to calculate the cost of all these proposals. If we follow the Australian model, that's a different situation. But we published the results of Mannix focus group. It was a focus group that was established, and nobody, and these focus groups include people from all political parties. Everybody was anonymous. No political group, whether it be representatives of MPs, senators, or public servants, nobody thought that this would be a good idea. That is, to develop policies per se. I agree with that because it's a focus group that led to observations. But I'd be happy to become an independent officer of Parliament if there was something that was drafted beforehand in legislation. My colleague Mustafa has said, well, we know what happens during an election cycle. There's going to be a risk associated with all this. And in another case, during an election year, where the government of the day comes forward with its budget and an election's triggered, I would imagine, and I think this would come under your normal jurisdiction, to as evaluate the fiscal framework of this platform. And when would it be appropriate to release your findings of this evaluation? During the last election, we were asked to provide a baseline that all political parties could use to understand economic growth, etc. And 2 months before the election, we had provided this document. You're talking about before the last elections, just at the start, at the outset of the election period. And some political parties use the document in order to make their own calculations, which was quite good because at least everybody was using the same baseline. And if the figures were a little bit deviated a bit from the baseline, well, that was okay. But I find that the premise of it was good.
I just have a couple of questions for clarification. So I want to get back to this costing of elections. We all agree that costing of election proposals is impossible. If the government were to amend it to go back to what it said, I believe, in their election campaign, to cost platform announcements or platforms, I just want to get clarity on this. Is that even something that your office can do?
I believe that would be more feasible to do for the PBO if it is platforms, not proposals, because I can tell you with a lot of certainty based on working for 9 years at the PBO that the way that the legislation is drafted right now, if it stays like that for platform costing, it would be operationally impossible for the PBO to do a good job with the quality that would be expected of the PBO. It just opens the door to all kinds of requests, and that would be impossible.
There's no question on the proposals.
Yes.
But it seems to me even platforms, just the time that you're working within is just, I just don't understand how it could even be done.
Again, under certain conditions would be possible if you receive the platforms, let's say 2 months before the election, which that might be an issue, challenge for the parties that are involved. And we have access to information, then that it is feasible to consider that it is possible to do. But in the current form, no, absolutely not.
Okay. I just want to, you were here when I asked Mr. Page. I'd just like to know who do you feel you work for? Parliamentarians or Canadian taxpayers?
Again, I think my response would not be that much different from what Mr. Page said. I think we certainly, under the legislation, we are here to serve parliamentarians. But again, parliamentarians also serve people, so indirectly we are serving the public. So when we release a report goes to everybody, and that's for the benefit of the parliamentarians certainly, and then others who are interested in that kind of analysis and work, and that would serve the whole public. I mean, it could be.
But it seems to me if we move to a system where you have to have your work plans approved, you are able to follow up on requests from members of parliament, things which don't happen today, you are then much more working at the will of the parliamentarians, because I see many of the reports you put out today, they're reports that you initiate, that you don't have to ask us to do it. I think you're doing that on behalf of Canadians. And so it would seem to me that many of these proposals are moving the PBO much more out of the independent role working on behalf of Canadians to be almost the servants of parliamentarians.
And you are absolutely right. I think there are two issues with the approval proposal. One is that actually even before, under the legislation, even before we put together a work plan, it says that we have to consult the speakers. So just imagine that we have to go consult with the speakers what kind of a work plan we want to have, and then draft that and put it in front of them for them to approve it. And that you're absolutely right. I mean, it would be up to them to decide what kind of work we can do, and that certainly affects the independence of the office.
I'll ask you one quick question on, it's not part of the proposal, I don't believe, but it was mentioned here in terms of an external review process of your, what are your thoughts on that?
It would be a great idea to have external review. I think it should have been part of the original legislation that the PBO is subject to review after 3 years, 5 years, and whatever the decision is. And it's quite normal now for other budget officers around the world that they have that kind of review process.
Last Question, Mr. Ouellette, 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. So I'd just like to go over the during an election as well. So in the technical briefing that I attended, it was discussed that in fact you can request help from departments in order to help doing costing. So they are, they can provide assistance, and there's also, I think, confidentiality. You shall not disclose to a minister any information related to a request for an estimate under subsection 3. So, in fact, there's protection to ensure that the opposition or government side, opposition sides, can all protect their information about what they're requesting. And one of the questions that I had related to that, and that was provide clarification, it was surrounding the idea of versus a proposal versus a platform. So, for instance, sometimes someone makes a proposal, and we want to find how much is this actually going to cost. This is great. We all have ideas, but if we discover all of a sudden that the idea is not cost effective or it's very expensive, well, perhaps we're going to decide at that point not to move forward with it. But we also don't want that, perhaps they don't want to be debating a policy proposal during an election. And so I think there's, a certain distinction to be made between a platform and to have that flexibility about what people are asking for. I also think, though, in the long term, what's going to happen, and this is just my opinion, is there's going to be an increase or a desire for instance, journalists are going to ask the parties, did you get that costed out by the PBO? And there's going to be almost this requirement that's going to exist over time that every time a political party shows up with a proposal during an election, that they're going to need to have that cost analysis. But I'm also certain that the ministers are going to, because civil servants won't be serving the government at that time, there's an election on, they're going to be hopefully serving you and making sure that you can get the information you need. But I guess that's just my comment after having read the legislation. And I'd just like to go back to Mr. Liepert's commentary. I think there's actually, it's not just parliamentarians, I think there's actually a cabinet. Parliamentarians, which cabinet is also a part of, and then the people. And I think it's incumbent upon parliamentarians to hold cabinet and government to account. But I was just wondering how we also hold the PBO to account for decisions that are made. How in the legislation or in proposed legislation would you propose that we can hold you account to ensure that you're doing the work of individual parliamentarians, not government, but parliamentarians themselves?
Through the speakers. I mean, that's why the speakers now have this control and direction over the PBOs. They will keep the PBO into account. I mean, they will become.
They're selected by the majority, but how do you ensure that you actually represent everyone?
And also the non-existing joint committee. Because keep in mind, I mean, the legislation refers continually to the joint committee. Finally, I mean, the other account is that we have to provide an annual report, as other agents of parliament are doing, to the two speakers at the end of the fiscal year. So this is the other accountability that will be in place for all the parliamentarians to look at the PBO work and see, okay, this is how you operated past year and so on. One thing is really interesting is Mr. Liepert, the question is that this Officer of Parliament, PBO, would become an independent agent of Parliament under Parliament of Canada Act. The PBO will not have its own legislation like the OAG, like the Commissioner of Information, and so on. So I mean, it will be similar to what you have in the House of on the House of Commons side, which is the Commissioner of Ethics, who is also under the Parliament of Canada Act. So the question of the relationship is always with Parliament. It's under the Parliament of Canada Act, and then on behalf of parliamentarians, through the reports. I mean, we do serve other stakeholders, publics, and so on. But it is a very distinction that is very important to make compared to other officers of Parliament.
We'll have to stop the questioning there, and I thank you for your presentations, for your open and answers and fairly direct answers. Meeting adjourned. We will reconvene tomorrow.
Thank you.